mind, I just can't seem to find a reason to believe that I can break free. But you see, I've been down for so long, feel like all hope is gone. But as I lift my hands, I understand that I should praise you through my circumstance. Take the shackles off my feet so I can dance. I just wanna praise you. I just wanna praise you. You broke the chains and I can't lift my hand. And I'm gonna praise you. I'm gonna praise you. Everything that could go wrong, all went wrong at one time. So much pressure fell on me. I thought I was gonna lose my mind. But I know you wanna see if I will hold on through these trials. But I need you to lift this load, 'cause I can't take it no more. Take the shackles off my feet so I can dance. I just wanna praise you. I just wanna praise you. You broke the chains and I can't lift my hand. And I'm gonna praise you. I'm gonna praise you. Through the fire and the rain, found in every kind of way. But God's broken every chain, so let me know by the rain now.
KTSU Houston, 90.9, your community station. The views or opinions expressed on the following program do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of the management and staff of KTSU FM, nor the Board of Regents of Texas Southern University. This is your community station, 90.9, KTSU Houston.
Good evening, Houston. Welcome to another edition of Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Senior Pastor of the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and I want to welcome you to this live edition of the best news and public affairs show you can hear on Sunday. As a matter of fact, I want to say and send a special shout out to our KTSU family who is on Facebook Live following along with all of those who follow me through a variety of means. Thank you so much for being with us on tonight. Tonight we will continue a discussion that we started last week. I want to thank all of you for giving me such positive feedback on last week's subject matter. We looked at the history of HISD and how it has dealt with African American children in particular. And there's been a number of things that were revealed on last week, and I had a number of educators say to me, you know what, man, I had no idea that's the history of the school district. Now, the reason it's important for you to know the history of what has happened is because we are dealing with the remnants of that historical reality. You're wondering why things are the way they are. There's a reason for that. And part of that is tied to the history. And so tonight, I'm going to ask a question, and then let's see if we can answer it by the end of tonight's show. Here's the question. Is the school system broke, or is it functioning as intended? Is the school system, the Houston Independent School District, is it broke, or is it functioning as intended? And let me just give you what my argument is going to be based on the data, based on the facts, based on the history And based on what we're seeing today, and we're talking about a history that goes back to when the school district was started in 1923 to what we're seeing right now today, and the recent history of historical failure of schools in our community and in our neighborhood, that I submit to you did not happen randomly or haphazardly, but they happened intentionally. If nothing else, through benign neglect. We see students in our community being undereducated and virtually unemployable. Now, are there outliers? There always are. There always are. President Barack Obama was an outlier. Every African American male has the potential to be president, but how plausible is that, right? He's an outlier. And so I'm saying to you that even if you point out some outliers who have made it, the masses of people, the masses of our students did not get all that they needed to be successful at every level of life. And, when we talk about education and Black history, one of the reasons I'm focusing on this is because I believe public education is the number one civil rights issue we must resolve in our community. It's the number one civil rights issue. Everybody else fights in their community for what they want because they understand the basic premise that nobody's going to give you what you're not willing to fight for. The story is told that A. Philip Randolph, that civil rights leader of the 30s and 40s on up into the 50s, went to Franklin Roosevelt, then president, and said to President Roosevelt, "You need to help the Negro in America," and shared with him his personal insight into the plight of Black people in this country. And it is reported that President Franklin Roosevelt said to A. Philip Randolph, "Make me." Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking, what? Franklin Roosevelt reportedly said to A. Philip Randolph, "Phil, make me." In other words, exercise the political will to make me do it. Because if you don't exercise the political will to make me do it, I'm going to bend to the political will of those sisters, where we have to get beyond just voting for Black or voting for Democrats or voting just for women. We got to get to the point now where we vote for right. Right? It doesn't matter, man, if a person, for me, it doesn't matter if a person's white or Black. It matters to me if they're going to do right. That's what I want to see. I'm excited. Somebody asked me what I thought about the new judges that were voted in and Black woman power. All that's great. But if they don't make the rulings on the bench that benefit all people, including people of color, if they don't make decisions that really reflect that Black lives matter, then it's a waste to have them on the bench. Now, I'm happy to report in just the month that they have been on, tremendous changes have taken place. I'll give you an example. You have bail bondsmen now who have made millions of dollars on the backs of poor people. People who, if they did not have the wherewithal to get a bond, set in jail, treated as if they were guilty until they could prove themselves innocent. Now, if that sounds backwards, it is, because you're supposed to be treated like you're innocent until proven guilty. But we have seen people treated as if they're guilty and they have to fight to prove themselves innocent. As a matter of fact, anytime a Black person goes into a courtroom, you are presumed to be guilty, whether you are the plaintiff or the defendant. Don't fool yourself. When you go into the courtroom and you have a non-Black on the other side of the table, you are presumed to be guilty. That's the assumption, that if somebody did something to you, you must have done something to them. And if somebody accuses you of something, you probably did it. So these judges now are creating a little brouhaha. You know what I mean? They're creating a little ruckus. They starting a little something. To the point that, check out the public documents, bail bondsmen, several of them now are filing lawsuits against the misdemeanor court judges. You know why? Because they're releasing people for low-level offenses on PR bonds, personal recognizance. In other words, you give me your word that you're going to come back, and we expect you to come back. Now, other folk have been getting it all along, and people with money who have been accused of far worse crimes. Because they had the money, they were able to pay their way out, and they had the means. And so now you have these misdemeanor court judges, several of them the new judges that have come in, who have said, you know what, bail reform is going to be a reality. So shout out to Judge Darrell Jordan and all of the new judges who have come on, and those who have come on board to say, you know what, we're not going to criminalize poverty. We're not going to keep people in jail because they don't have the money. And the bail bonds lobbying group has been fighting bail reform because that's how they make their millions and millions of dollars. Remember, there's an old Jamaican saying, bad times are good times for somebody. So while people who are poor are in jail, that's a bad time for them. But it's a great time for people who have bail bonding companies who will say, hey, I'll help you get out. And if you can't afford to get out, you just stay in there until you're ready to get this bond. So they're literally suing these judges. Crazy, right? If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on Instagram at DZ Cofield. You can also follow me on Twitter at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield. We also want to send a shout of condolence out to the family of Cassandra Holloman. Cassandra was one of the new judges who were voted in and was sworn in the month of January. And she succumbed to an illness and passed away. Her homegoing celebration was yesterday. We hosted it at the Good Hope Church. She was not a member of our church, but we worked with the family and Pastor Buggs of the Fellowship Church, and the funeral was tremendously well attended. All of the judges were there and marched in behind their fallen colleague. Mayor Turner was there. County Commissioner Rodney Ellis was there. County Judge Lena Lodago was there. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people who were there to pay their respects and show their love and support to this family. And so we certainly want to remember this family in our prayers. Now, as we get started tonight, let's give the backdrop of what we're looking at, because I think it's important. First of all, we are commemorating this year the 400th anniversary of the first African slave being brought to this continent. The first recorded slave brought to this continent, 1619, in Virginia. So we're celebrating the 400th anniversary, this Sankofa moment. And the fact that it was illegal to educate slaves serves as the backdrop for everything that I'm going to talk about tonight. As a matter of fact, there's several historical and cultural watershed moments that shape what we're doing today and what we're fighting for today. And I want to ask you a question. Just file this away somewhere. Who benefits from everything staying the same? Oh, and by the way, I'm going to give you some insight on this investigation being conducted by TEA. Because based on the facts that I know, there's no way this board should stay in place. And those of you who are fighting to keep this board in place and keep TEA out, you don't know all the facts. Because I can't believe, if you are a person of any integrity and want what's best for all children, that you would fight to keep this board in place. Now, when I talk about the board, please don't send me any emails or text messages talking about individual board members, because that's the problem. The board doesn't function individually. They function as a group. So when they violate, for example, the Open Meetings Act, they violate it as a group, even though only 5 of them may have participated. The entire group violated it. And so the entire group is held accountable for that act of illegality. And people can write it off and they can try to push it under the table. And the president of the board, Diana Davila, she said, oh, we're going to comply and we're going to, man, they are so guilty, it's ridiculous. They are like the NFL with Colin Kaepernick. The NFL settled, not because they were innocent. Man, please, they knew some stuff was going to come out in that hearing that they didn't want to come out, and it was better to pay. The problem is the HISD board can't pay to make the investigation go away. They can't pay, they can't settle to make it go away. I'll talk about that in a moment. So the illegality of educating African slaves is one of the backdrops that we look at the education of blacks in this country with that behind. The other issue, and we know this happens, is the fear that white people have of black people, and specifically black males. Specifically black males. And that was fueled by that turn of the century movie, The Birth of a Nation, where black men were seen to be savages, and all white women were in danger, and black men couldn't be trusted, they had no morals, and all of those negative images that were fueled and fostered throughout movie imagery throughout the years. Okay? So you have the illegality of educating slaves on one hand, and then you have movies like The Birth of a Nation and other things that's stoking the fear of people. Okay? So it's in that backdrop that you have HISD being formed in 1923. Now, I pastor the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church. The Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church will be 147 years old the 4th Sunday in March. Next month, we will be 147 years old. So we were founded in 1872. We're one of the older African American churches in Houston, founded, like many of them, including Antioch and others, in the brush arbor by those freed slaves that were part of that first migration into the big city of Houston, who settled in an area that was called Friedmans Town. Now, Friedmans Town is today called Midtown. It was Friedmans Town, and then it was 4th Ward, and then it shifted from 4th Ward, and then later on it was dubbed to be Midtown. Well, it's important for you to know that people were planning the exit of people of color out of Friedmans Town long before the reality of Midtown was realized. Okay? I can remember when I got here in 1994, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee asked me to go up with a delegation that included Linwood Johnson, the late Linwood Johnson, and others, to go meet with then Secretary of HUD, Henry Cisneros. And Henry Cisneros was feeding us a bunch of crap. And one of the things he was saying is the law that was being used to justify the tearing down, the demolition of Allen Parkway Village, public housing, was the issue of density. And then he made the mistake of saying it was the same law that was used in Chicago to justify the demolition of the Cabrini Green housing projects. For those of you who remember the show Good Times, Those were pictures of the Cabrini Green housing projects. Okay, so you had a density level there that was unbelievable in terms of 12, 13-story buildings with 7 to 8 apartments. Those apartments typically were 2 bedrooms, and you would have anywhere from 2 to 4 people, 6 people in there. Some apartments with 3 bedrooms. And those public housing tenements were known for their density. The other thing he didn't know was that I grew up in the Jacob Riis housing projects in New York City. I lived on the 13th floor, apartment 13H, 465 East 10th Street. Okay, so we probably had 10 to 15, 20,000 people living in a 2 or 3 block radius. I mean, it was that dense in terms of the number of people who lived in those urban public housing tenements. That's not what Allen Parkway was. Allen Parkway, man, was like townhouses for me. I saw grass. I saw people living next door to each other, right? I'm like, what? Man, this is nice. Shoot, I want to live here. So when I questioned Henry Cisneros and this application of that law to the demolition of Allen Parkway Village, he looked at me, he said, well, Reverend, you just got here. You're new to this. We've been working on this a long time, and this is over. This is done with. And I looked at him, I said, oh, really? And I looked at the Congresswoman, I said, well, I didn't need to come, because this dude has already made up his mind. And they came to a compromise. Linwood Johnson and Gladys House and others filed lawsuits, and they came to a compromise. And the demise of Friedmans Town, 4th Ward, was facilitated and hastened by the move of Booker T. Washington out of 4th Ward, out of Friedmans Town. And that was strategic. That was planned. White folk planned it, y'all. Now, we got all excited, man, and we fell for the okie doke. We fell for the trickaroo. It was the sleight of hand. It's like, where are we going to build you a new school? Where you going to build it? We got all this land out here. We're going to build you a new school out here, y'all. And everybody was excited for Booker T. Washington High School, which was originally the colored high school and was the original secondary school for blacks in Houston, in Friedmans Town. And when Booker T. Washington moved, the fabric of the community began to unravel. Right? There are 3 things families look for when they look to move into a neighborhood. They look for schools, if they have children, the quality of those schools. They look for food, and they want safety. If you don't have schools and you don't have food, you're in a food desert, and you don't have a safe neighborhood, people don't want to move in there. And I think the 4th thing would be the quality of housing stock. All right? Now, I submit to you that nothing has really been gained for students of color from HISD that wasn't fought for. From Hattie Mae White, for whom fighting for children was a life calling. And in the mid-60s, she and a lady named Gertrude Barnstorm were the 2 politically liberal members of the school board who often clashed with the more conservative board members in meetings fighting for the rights of children of color. Brown versus the Board of Education was passed in 1954. Why didn't it become a reality until the 1960s here in Houston? And by the way, the Houston Independent School District was the largest segregated school district in the country. The largest racially segregated school system in the United States. So why did it take until the 60s for integration to begin to take place? Not take place, because it still really hasn't taken place. We're still educating our children in a segregated system, whether it's segregated ethnically, racially, or socioeconomically. Well, it was in the 60s that a lawsuit was filed And HISD fought it. Now, you know, I've been in Texas long enough to know, man, Texas is a different state, right? There's still people in the state of Texas who want to fight for independence from the United States of America. They still want to be their own country. So I understand that. What's interesting is when people in Texas and people in the South said by their words and their actions, we're not going to comply with the ruling of the Supreme Court. We don't care what you say. Go back and report it to whomever you are going to report it to. We are not going to comply. And that's what they said in regards to Brown versus the Board of Education. We are not going to comply. By the way, you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your community station, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. And what brought about the hastening of integration? And I've got a show coming up looking at Brown versus the Board of Education 65 years later and asking the question, are our students of color better off now than they were in 1954? Are students better off since Brown versus the Board was passed? And you might be surprised at what the data says. Not what you feel anecdotally, but what the data says. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. So, being faced now with this call, this mandate to integrate, which was not the intent or purpose of Brown versus the Board. It wasn't about integration. Read it for yourself. It really wasn't about that. It was about creating a truly separate and equal system. That if we're not going to school together, give us the resources, the same resources. So we don't have hand-me-down books and hand-me-down uniforms and broken equipment that's coming to our side of town after y'all get through using it on your side of town. You got new uniforms, we want new uniforms. You get a new building, we want a new building, right? So that it's equal. And rather than make it equal, they play games around it. I was really moved when I read about this local African-American leader who was a youth minister at the time, who challenged Wheatley students to boycott school in protest of integration not taking place. And the thought was that integration would make things better for our students, right? So I'm not blaming anybody who thought that, because that was the thought. I mean, we grew up in an era where the white man's ice was colder and his water was wetter. And so we said, hey, man, if we can get to school white folk, man, we're going to be better off as a people. And when William Lawson, that minister, asked Wheatley students to boycott school, 5 days afterwards, 10% of Wheatley students attended schools. 10% of Wheatley students attended schools. 10% attended classes. That means 90% didn't. Now, you know what got HISD's attention at that time? Money! Money, 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 money. It's all about the money, baby. It's all about the Benjamins. In 1970, when that federal judge asked the district to speed up the integration process, HISD acquiesced because they were losing money. Every 1,000 children was worth somewhere between $10 and $12 million. Every 1,000 children worth between $10 and $12 million. When you add Title I and Title II and any other modifications and anything else, that's what you're looking at. Okay? Now, simultaneously, Mexican Americans were being discriminated against. And I got to give this background. For those of you who were with me last week, man, just bear with me. Got to give this background. Mexican Americans were being discriminated against as well. Here's why. Because to show that the district was integrating, they put the black students with the Mexican students. And I know the Latino population is more diverse now. But at that time, the overwhelming majority of Latinos in HISD were Mexicans, right? The children of Mexicans. And they classified them as white. So the Latino students weren't being educated properly because they stuck them in a building with the black folk and said, y'all are white. And then they reported to the Department of Education and said, see, we integrating because we got white students and black students in school together over here because they were calling the Mexican students white. Now, I want to shift real quick. And by the way, many Mexican Americans took their children out of schools and protests. They took them into what they called huelgas. Huelgas are protest schools. And in 1970, it was August 31st, 1970, right at the beginning of school, organized by the Mexican American Education Council, they began 3 weeks of boycotts, protests, and picketing. Here we go again, fighting for what you believe in. This action lasted about 3 weeks, during which up to 75% of the student bodies at some high schools participated in the boycotts. Kids are absent. You say, why is that significant? Because when children don't go to school, the district doesn't get paid. When children don't go to school, districts don't get paid. I told you it's about the money. Charter schools are public schools. They're funded by our public dollars. They are part of school choice. But the traditional ISDs, for the most part, are threatened by charter schools. You know why? Because they take students. And what happens when they take students? They take money. Right? So now we're in the 1970s. And this last piece I've got to share. In 1990, the student body of HISD, 43% were Hispanic, 40% were black, 15% were white. Okay? So we weren't the majority then as black students, but blacks and Latinos created in 1990 a minority-majority district. But here's what's interesting. The majority of board members were not Latino or African American. The majority of the board members were white. And they continued to make decisions that benefited their white people who were part of their constituency. It benefited white people at the expense of black and brown. That's how we got into this black and brown thing. Okay? That's how we got into the black and brown thing. Because decisions were made that benefited white folk at the expense of black folk and Latino people. Now I'll give you an example. River Oaks Elementary School was the first school to implement HISD's Vanguard program in the fall of 1972. And the program, the Vanguard program, was for 4th through 6th graders. The program was initially named the Elementary School for the Gifted. And the Vanguard program was adopted a year later. Now I've got to tell you something so you'll get this. Magnet schools have been bad for the overwhelming majority of African American students. Now, listen before you react. When the first magnet schools were formed, they were formed as an attempt to foster voluntary desegregation. That's what they were formed to do. So here's what they did. They said, okay, we're going to start this magnet school and we're going to build it around this special skill set. Check the numbers. So let's just say, for the sake of math, we have 100 slots available. We have 100 slots available. And then you know what we're going to do? For magnet programs, we're going to designate slots for various ethnic and racial groups. So let's say we have 40 for white students, because they have to have more slots, and we're going to have 20 for African American students and 20 for Latino students, and the last 20 will split between other races, right? Asians, Indians, etc. We'll split those with other races. And we have those slots that have to be filled. And so here's what we do. We're going to have you apply for the slots. So now you have to get approved to be in the slots. So when an African American applies to get into the magnet school, we're going to scrutinize you. We're going to check you. You're not going to come in here if you Pookie or Ray Ray. No. Because white folk don't want to go to school with Pookie and Ray Ray. They want to go to school with upstanding, upper middle class African Americans. Actually, we prefer Afro Americans or Negroes who know how to act and know how to behave and know their place. Those are the students we're going to let into those magnet programs. Now you say, well, why does that hurt black students? I'll tell you why. Because they went to the black schools and took the best teachers out. See, white people have never had a problem with black people who took care of them. From the images of Mammy with Gone with the Wind to the best and brightest black teachers, white kids and parents have never had. They'll have a black, they'll talk about Negroes. They'll use the N-word and have a black woman taking care of their children. They've never had a problem with black people in that kind of role. But they don't want their children playing with their children. They don't want our children playing with their children. Right? They were telling the story when Lena Horne would perform in Las Vegas, they would drain the pool so she wouldn't get in it. Because she got in it one time. And I guess blackness was going to come off of her. And white people wouldn't get in the swimming pool. So they shut down the pool so she couldn't get in it. It was under repair while she was there. And they filled it immediately after she was gone. Okay? So you have these magnet schools and they're pulling the best teachers out of the black schools. They're pulling the best teachers out. So that means this black teacher who was teaching at a black school, an elementary school, for example, or a middle school, and she's teaching 100 kids or 200 kids. Now she gets pulled into this middle school, and we're going to pay you more money to go teach in this magnet school. Right? That's an honor. We're going to put you in this magnet school, but now instead of teaching 100 or 200 of your children, we got a slot of 20 over here. We got a slot of 20. And then white folk, listen, they got mad. I can talk about River Oaks because my son went there. My youngest son went there. Right? It was this Vanguard program. And then you had a number of young white couples who moved back into the River Oaks area. And they were getting married and raising their children. And they couldn't get their children into River Oaks Elementary because there wasn't room for them. There wasn't room because it was a Vanguard program. So then, you know what HISD did? They changed it to a local school. And basically said, all of you who are in the Vanguard program, y'all got to find somewhere else to go. We'll let some of y'all stay, but we got to make room for the local kids. Because the local white children, they want to come here. They want to bring their children here. But there wasn't enough of the white children being born in River Oaks who wanted to go to River Oaks Elementary. So then they turned around and they reinstituted the Vanguard program. I mean, it's crazy, y'all. But they took the best black teachers out of our schools and sent them to the magnet schools. So that hurt the students who were in those black schools, who lost those great black teachers. That hurt the teaching corps because they didn't have those mentor teachers there to help them. You lost that longevity of those teachers who had been there and had taught not just the children, but they had taught the children's children of some of their kids. So I can't go back and my child talk about Miss Rennet mistreating him or her in the first grade, and Miss Rennet was my first grade teacher. I'm gonna walk in there and say, hey, Miss Rennet, and she gonna say, Derek, hey, how are you doing? I'm gonna say, that's my son. And she said, I thought that was your boy, looked just like you. And he acts a lot like you, but he talks too much in class. You think I'm gonna cuss Miss Rennet out? You think I'm gonna tell Miss Rennet off? Especially Miss Rennet knows me, and I know Miss Rennet. Now that's when I'm gonna ask my son, why Miss Rennet gonna lie on you? Because she know your daddy. We lost those historical relationships with principals and teachers who were being pulled. I remember at Douglas Elementary School, where Yellowstone Academy is right now, I remember going there. LaSalle Donnell, Mr. Donnell was the principal and had been the principal there for years. And I remember as they were planning the closing of Douglas Elementary, they started stripping teachers out of there. And one of those teachers was ordered to go teach at the Rice School, the new Rice School, La Escuela de Rice, right? It was a school in conjunction with Rice University, and they had this bilingual program, amazingly failing bilingual program, because you had kids who went there, who graduated, who didn't know how to speak any Spanish other than hola and como está, right? It was so bad that Rice disassociated themselves with the school, even though they allowed HISD to continue to use the name. Rice University said, no, we're not even going to be a part of this. But of course, you didn't hear about that, right? And then you have that 1977 move of citizens in West Houston, who tried to form the Westheimer Independent School District out of a portion of HISD. And I talked to somebody this past week. It was really interesting. They told me that this was going to be the first ISD that was going to pull out of Houston ISD, but there were three others that were on the table. There were three others that were on the table that would have left all of the black and brown kids to themselves. I'm not sure we wouldn't have been better off then. But it would have been tough, because what would have happened is, with those students would have went the largest tax base in terms of property taxes and things like that, because you would have had the affluent homes and areas, and they would have diverted the money. And of course, they wouldn't have allowed students to transfer into those districts, right? So that's the problem. Let me ask you a couple of questions, because I got to get moving here. First, this TEA investigation. So let me talk a little bit about that. This TEA investigation is regarding the October board meeting and claims that there were violations of the Open Meetings Act. Now, I've got to ask y'all something. I want you to think with me and let's be logical, okay? First of all, the violation of the Open Meetings Act does not have to take place with all of the board members in the same room at the same time, okay? So contrary to popular opinion, 5 of the 4 board members, 5 of the 4 don't have to sit down and have lunch together, and that's the only way they can violate the Open Meetings Act. You can violate the Open Meetings Act by having what you would call a daisy chain meeting. Here's a daisy chain meeting. I talk to one person, I talk to another person, tell that one person, I talk to the other person, here's how we're going to vote, what do you think? And then that person says, well, if the 2 of y'all gonna vote like that, I'm gonna vote like that. Well, what about person number 4? You know what, I'm gonna check with person number 4. Person number 4, I talked to person number 2 and number 3. We were talking about this, and this is the way we think we should go. What do you think? Person number 4 says, well, if 1, 2, and 3 are gonna do it, I'm down, but we need 5. Person number 4 says, I'll tell you what, so you don't violate the Open Meetings Act, I'll talk to person number 5. Person number 4 goes and talks to person number 5 and says, hey, person number 5, I'll talk to person number 1 who talked to person number 2 and number 3, and we're all on the same page. You in? I'm in. Let me call person number 1. Person number 1. I'll talk to person number 5. You violated the Open Meetings Act. You violated the Open Meetings Act. And what the HISD board obviously didn't know, and I'm talking specifically now about those 5 that voted to bring Dr. Saavedra back. What they didn't know is the moment they voted the way they did that Thursday night, that Friday, folk were calling for an investigation. That Friday. I'm talking about elected officials. And they weren't all black. I'm talking about white elected officials. Was like, oh, Hades, no. Because if y'all do that to the black folk, you can do that to the white folk too. So what did they do? They called for an investigation. Man, listen, you start pulling phone records and text messages and emails. Oh, and by the way, tell me this is not strangely coincidental. Dr. Saavedra was serving at the South San Antonio School District. He was the superintendent there. And his resignation date was December 31st, 2018. All right, December 31st, 2018. So how does his resignation date all of a sudden get changed to coincide with the Friday after the Thursday vote, and he was prepared to take over on that Monday in October? How did he change his date if somebody hadn't talked to him and assured him that a majority of the board members were going to vote him in? He was ready to come in and take over that Monday. Come on now, we was born at night, not last night. Somebody help me in here. This dude changed his resignation date to the Friday before the Monday he was supposed to take over. So that he already knew. They already knew what the deal was. The fix was in. And I'll be honest with you. Anybody who wants what's right, if you fight for the status quo to stay in place and this board to stay in place, with the majority of the board members being as crooked and underhanded, sneaky and conniving as they are, I don't care if the 4 other board members were 4 of the apostles. If you have the majority who are that crooked, that conniving, that underhanded, that scheming, everybody's got to go. Everybody got to go. That's the sacrifice that needs to be made for the sake of our children. Shame on us if we fight to keep a crooked board in place. Oh, here's another question I've got to ask you. Got to ask you this. If schools have been failing 7, 8, 9 years, either the board and or the superintendents don't know what to do or they don't want to do it. They either don't know what to do or they don't want to do it. Because some of these schools were failing when Saavedra was here the first time. Some of these schools were failing when Saavedra was here the first time. And they're still failing. And with all due respect to Dr. Grenita Latham, I've tried to have her on the show. We've sent out requests. We haven't been able to get her on the show. But I watched an interview that she did with Fox 26 today, and she gave all of the educationally, politically correct answers, everything that you want to hear. We're going to send more resources, and if the administrators, if they need more help, all they have to do is let us know, and I'm going to meet with them quarterly, and we're going to do this, and the blah, 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 and the blue, 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 and the garbage, garbage, garbage. You know why? Because that's the same answer every superintendent gives us. You know, that's like every resume looks good, right? Every person looks great until they get in the position. Then you find out they just went to the same resume writing course that everybody else went to. Dr. Latham, I love you, respect you, don't know you. But God dog it, boy, that's the same answer we've been getting. It's the same answer Saavedra gave us the first time around. It's the same answer Greer gave us. That's the answer Greer gave us. That was the whole premise behind the Apollo 20 schools. Y'all remember Apollo 20? You probably don't remember it because it started with this big fanfare, and 19 of those 20 schools failed after we spent millions of dollars. And Greer didn't want to talk about the 19 failures and buried the one success and helped to run that principle out of HISD. 1 out of 20 schools actually passed. And they passed not because of the stuff that they did trying to replicate KIPP. I mean, it was a poor man's KIPP. They tried to change the structure without understanding the culture. And they blew it. So what I'm saying is, man, you giving us the same answers that we've gotten in the past? What difference does it make? And I'm saying, look, outcomes haven't changed. So why are we keeping the same people in place? Why are we keeping the same people in place? Why are we fighting to keep the same people in place? We're demanding a board to do something that they have been unable or unwilling to do for generations. The truth of the matter is, we just found out about these schools failing, like they're failing, since House Bill 1842 was passed. Schools have been failing before that. Matter of fact, the only one who really had been honest with us about the conditions of schools is Children at Risk. Children at Risk, they've been ranking schools. Now, you may think their ranking can go into more depth and in more detail, but they've been, I think, the most objective raters of schools in the state. And when you look at Children at Risk and you look at their rankings of schools, and we have 4 schools that are on the verge of putting the entire school board into receivership or being run by the board of managers appointed by TEA, and there are schools in HISD who rank lower than those high schools. They just haven't been failing 5 straight years. They haven't been failing 5 straight years. That's the only reason those schools are not on the list. But when you have schools that are ranked lower than Kashmir, who has been failing 9 straight years, come on, we got a bigger problem. House Bill 1842 just revealed the problem, but the problem was already there. So I asked you a question earlier: who benefits from things staying the same? Not our children, not black children. If things don't change, our children don't benefit from it. Who benefits from things being the way they are right now? Okay? And even when Dr. Latham was asked about more money coming in, I was really disappointed with her answer. I hope she's listening. If she's not, somebody tell her I was disappointed, for what it's worth to her. Because the first thing she talked about was teachers getting more money. That's the first thing she talked about, teachers getting more money. And somebody talked about teachers getting $5,000 more a year. $5,000 more a year. Man, our kids are failed. We have failed our children. And I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the show, I think education is the #1 civil rights issue facing our society today. Here's why. Everything that we talk about goes back to education. Unemployment goes back to education. The school to prison pipeline starts where? In the school. Education. Juvenile delinquency. Education. When you look at the prison system is full of undereducated, virtually unemployable men and women. It starts with education. Now we're seeing the same thing with special ed, and the Latinos are waking up. They're fighting, y'all, because we've moved out of the hood into the lands, and a few of us who are part of the talented 10th that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, we've moved out of the hoods into the lands, sugar land, rich pear land, the woodlands. We live in the lands now, right? We like George and Wheezy. We've been moving up, y'all. So we're not fighting anymore because we think we're immune to this. If my child got accepted into a magnet program, well, I ain't worried about the kids that didn't get in. They better hunt their own rabbit. That's been our attitude. That's been our mentality. When we become the acceptable Negro to white folk, then we think we've made it. When in actuality, we really haven't. We're just being tolerated until it is no longer convenient or necessary. There are bills now that are being promoted and lobbied for to increase funding in education. Do you think more money's going to do it? Do you really think more money's going to do it? See, here's what I would argue to you. You have to go back years in at least one generation. And when I say years, you have to go back now 30, 40 years to see quality education across the board in African American schools. And they were facilitated by longtime principals and longtime teachers who were functioning both in a segregated school system and the early stages of a desegregated school system. Guess what? A Lamar High School didn't want to play Jack Yates and no football or basketball in the 60s or 70s. Come on now. They didn't want to play no Phyllis Wheatley back in the day, because them white boys would have got their clocks clean. But Lamar play Yates now when they have the best and brightest Yates students transferring into Lamar. Oh, they can hold their own now because their school population is 3 times the size of Yates. And they pulled the best student athletes out of the black community and willingly accepted them. Oh yeah, they'll play now. But they wasn't going to play back in the day. And those of you who attended schools back then, you know I'm telling the truth. So here's the question. What are we prepared to do? Number one, do we have any fight in us? And I'm talking to you who are native Houstonians. Do you have any fight in you? I didn't graduate from any school from Houston. Wish I had come to Houston earlier. Wish I had moved. Wish I could say I'm a Jack Yates line. Or I graduated from Wheatley. I wish I could say I was part of their history. I'm not, but that doesn't change my commitment. But for those of you who grew up here, who were part of this fabric, what are you prepared to do? See, the truth of the matter is most folk in Houston don't know how to fight. Somebody described Houstonians, black Houstonians, as zoo-raised lions. I didn't say it, don't get mad at me. They basically said because the ending of Jim Crow and desegregation was a negotiated item, that black folk don't have the fight that other cities have. Because white folk decided when desegregation was going to end. And it didn't end crazy. If you don't believe me, find the documentary, The Strange Demise of Jim Crow. The Strange Demise of Jim Crow tells the story of the negotiated end of desegregation. When the Greater Houston Partnership, that same partnership that runs the city of Houston today and has been running this city for years, that Greater Houston Partnership looked at Birmingham and looked at those stores being broken and folk protesting and fire hoses and dogs. And you know what the Greater Houston Partnership said? That's not good for business. We're not going to have that in Houston. So they picked a day to desegregate restaurants and then asked for a good Negro couple to go and desegregate that restaurant on a specific day, and then called for a news whiteout and told all of the television reporters, radio, and print media, you can't report it for 2 weeks. Read the story. Read the story. You'll be surprised. Here's the other thing I want to end with today. House Bill 1842 has revealed the problem, a generational problem. Because I think we can argue the the education of African American students. Before they became African American, they were Afro Americans and Negroes and colored. It was never the intention of the Houston Independent School District to educate our children. Never their intention. If we got it, we had to get it on our own. It was never their intention. That's why they're so culturally ignorant and unaware of how to educate our children. Now, they're ignorant in educating Latino children too, but the Latinos recognize they're in the majority. Like, they over like 65% of the kids in HISD. So when they say we're demanding a Latino superintendent, that's why. Because they got the overwhelming majority of kids. And even though black folk, we have the largest black population in Houston, west of the Mississippi, our numbers are going down percentage-wise. The number of Latinos is going up. So they're going to fight. They're fighting. They're like, look, hey, y'all say what you want to say. I don't agree what they did in October, but I understand why they did it. I don't agree with it. I don't approve of it. I don't sanction it, but I understand. Because they like, you know what? We're going to get this sister out, and we're going to bring somebody in that we know who's going to take care of our kids. And we won't fight for our own children. And then we get mad when somebody won't give us what we have been unwilling to fight for ourselves. Here's the other thing. Senate Bill 1882. I think I'm going to do a whole show on this. I got to get out of here, man. 1882 gives us the vehicle to take care of our own schools and our own kids. Parents, community stakeholders, we don't need an outside charter group to take over our school. We don't need somebody else. We can develop our own plan for our own children. Parents and community partners can come together and we can take care of our own children. Well, I got to get out of here. Man, that hour went by so fast, y'all. Whoa, went by so fast. Somebody said I'd be a great filibuster. Well, I don't know about that. But I'm going to get out of here and make way for our next program here on your community station. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And man, we've got to fight for our kids. We can't lose another generation to miseducation, undereducation, and unemployability. I'm Dr. DZ Cofield, your host for Real World, Real Talk. Next week, we've got a couple of special shows coming up. We'll be talking to the Poor People's Campaign. They're coming to Houston. The Reverend Barber out of North Carolina will be in the city. And we're going to look at Brown versus the Board of Education. We'll also have some health disparities that we need to look at in our community. So, stay with us here on your number one source for jazz and more, your community station, KTSU. Facebook Live family, God bless. Take care.
Jazz and more. Supporting your community station, KTSU, is Health Markets Companies. In business nationwide since 1984, Health Markets offer health, medical, and life insurance with a network of national carriers, including Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, MetLife, and Humana, among others. Health Markets can enroll individuals and small businesses at any time of the year. They are located at 16103 West New York, Suite H, just west of Highway 6. For more information, the number is 281-298-6188. 90.9 KTSU Houston. Your community station. Your community station. Community station.
They ain't coming, Joe. You were told they weren't coming, so.
Yeah, Dean's over. Yeah. So I'm just going to let it go right here, right?
So. Yes, I'm loving the joke, which is HIST right now. You'll get the money, but it'll be after TEA takes over it.
I'm just at a loss. Why you want to fight? I don't understand it. Like,
We gonna win. They gonna win anyway. If you gonna fight it, okay. Be my guest.
I mean, they talking about, oh, we're gonna fight for more money. For what?
You know what I mean? That's it. You wanna get the money when TEA takes over. So if you don't know the history, so you got your KTSU 90.9, your community station with B. Michael McKay and Truth. My brother from another mother is here, David Goldstein, and the indivisible, beautiful Asia. In the meantime, listen, don't you leave where you are. Stay tuned in, we'll be right back. Soup 90.9 KTSU, your community station.
I'm good. Yes, sir. You can go to the KTSU Facebook page. It's recorded there. Right. Yeah, you should be able to go and see that there. Let me see. Yeah, you can. This is DZ Cofield. That was actually me. I'm talking to you. You watching me talk to you. Yeah. So what you can do is actually go to my Facebook page and find it there. It's just DZ Cofield. Facebook at DZ Cofield. You can find it right there. Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually 2 parts. So I started last week and then continued it this week. Exactly. All right, no problem. All right.